Thank you very much. I can tend to be a slightly fidgety speaker. I get rather excited, so I'm trying one of these little sort of Madonna mics. I hope you can hear me okay. It's a real privilege to be here. Thank you very much for having me. My brief was to be provocative, so if I offend any of you, please remember it's just a lecture. And we can discuss it afterwards. But old masters, old-fashioned, and I'll be talking about how we could perhaps reach new audiences with our shared love for old masters. Incidentally, it says on the brochure that I'm an art dealer. I used to be an art dealer, so I've now left the dark side. But it's going to be some time before I join the Jedi Knights amongst you. Old masters dominate my life. Everything, I think, or so many of the good things in my life have come through a passion for old masters. I made a television program a few years ago about the discovery of a portrait by Alan Ramsay of Bonnie Prince Charlie, which was subsequently acquired by the National Portrait Gallery in Scotland. And the director of that television program and I are now married, and we had a baby girl, so we couldn't call her either Alan or Ramsay, but we would have done had it been a boy. But we all know, I think, that old masters are not old-fashioned. Some of the papers we've heard from earlier, the optimistic view from the RKD here, marvelous. We all know they're not old-fashioned, but there are significant challenges that we face, both to counter that prevailing narrative, which is out there, especially in the media, and also if we're to sustain and even grow our audiences for old masters in the future. So I just want to talk about some of those themes today. I talked about the media. There's definitely been a push in some sections of the media, I think, to sort of downplay old masters. The New York Times seems particularly to not like old masters. Does anybody else notice that? There's been a whole run of articles about how old masters are yesterday's news and nobody wants to buy them anymore. Here's a little headline from a piece in 2016, Can the Old Masters Be Relevant Again?, which gave the headline figure that values in that year fell by 33%, which sounds extraordinary. And in those days, I really was an art dealer, so you read those figures and you think, oh my God, what's going on? But actually read the small print, and what they were referring to was they made a mistake, and they were talking about overall sale total, so it wasn't values. This was a figure taken from a TFAF market report. But it's worth looking into a little bit more detail about some of the lines that were given in that kind of article. At a time when contemporary art is all the rage, among collectors, viewers, and donors, many experts are questioning whether the old master artwork, once the most coveted, can stay relevant at auction houses, galleries, and museums. Having struggled with shrinking inventory and elusive profits, auction houses appear to be devoting most of their attention and resources to contemporary art, the most popular area of their business. So this is some of the challenge we're up against, ladies and gentlemen. And then the article quoted Edward Dolman, who was chairman and chief executive of Phillips Auction House, who said, auction houses want to be associated with the new and the now. But we all know there's one thing that art history teaches us. It is that the new and the now can very quickly become the old and the then. So I think we must have faith. And also, articles like this don't really tell you the full story of what's going on in the modern, contemporary, and old master markets. And I want to spend just a few moments setting out my case for that. Of course, we should mention that Edward Dolman at Phillips doesn't have an old master department, and their entire business model is based on modern and contemporary sales. So, of course, he would say that, wouldn't he? I think a lot of people point to headline sales figures in old master auctions compared to modern and contemporary auctions. And they also point to the decline in the number of old master dealers or specialist galleries, which is certainly true. And there's, in those articles and things like the New York Times, there's never a shortage of what I call the old guard of the old master dealers sort of complaining about and wondering where all the clients have gone. But I think we're seeing two separate and distinct phenomena, which should not be allowed to cloud our judgment that old masters themselves are old-fashioned and unpopular. The first thing to note is that the modern contemporary market, we're seeing a complete revolution in how art is sold. I think it's most particularly well demonstrated by the fact that so much modern contemporary art is manufactured in these series. I mean, Warhol is a great example of how often you can get, how many Elvis Presley prints did you do? 100. And they're all in series. So you can very easily get a benchmark value of what the latest Warhol Elvis is worth. And therefore, it becomes this fantastic market, this fantastic sort of speculative bubble, some say, in which it's possible to try and sort of game the system, so that if you have recently bought 3 Elvis Presley Warhol prints, then suddenly it becomes in your interest to make sure that the next 5 and 6 make a certain price, and so it encourages a whole different way of bidding, and participants in the market, we know, are bidding to keep prices up. And then there's a decline in the old master dealer or specialist gallery. And that, I think, really reflects the fact that auction houses have now become the dominant way of selling old master art. The internet has really revolutionized how we sell art. And many of you may have been to TFAF, and a common reflection is that it's very rare that you see new things that you may not have already seen before. And that's because dealers these days find supply so difficult when you're up against the internet, where it's very easy to look up the price of what someone paid for their stock. Art is a fantastically searchable asset class, if you like, because you can find the price so quickly. You can go into a gallery and within 15 seconds you can find out how much the dealer paid for it if they bought it at auction. And that does not necessarily encourage you to give them a profit. And so as a result, I think we've seen a shrinking in the old master dealer market and the dominance at auction. But again, that shouldn't, I think, make us feel that old masters themselves are not popular amongst collectors still. We've discussed in earlier, Esme mentioned the Leonardo, the Salvator Mundi. I do want to talk about that briefly, but from a slightly different perspective. And I thought it was very interesting that the prevailing narrative assumed, when Christie's decided to sell the Salvator Mundi alongside a modern contemporary art sale, everybody thought, well, this is where the money is. So we must put an old master picture in a modern contemporary sale. And they made a big play of offering the Salvator Mundi next to an Andy Warhol, what was it, the 60 Last Suppers. And this was going to be a wonderful marriage of Leonardo and Warhol. And the Leonardo had an estimate, I think, of about $100 million, and the Andy Warhol was estimated at $60 million. And there was going to be this great roadshow of the two giants of old master and modern contemporary art. But what happened? Well, the Salvator Mundi very quickly took all of the attention, and the queues went round the block. And really, everybody very quickly forgot about the Andy Warhol 60 Last Suppers. And before the sale, people were saying, oh, well, Christie's have made taken a risky gamble here, haven't they? Because, what if the old master, what if the Leonardo doesn't sell in the dominant modern and contemporary sale? Then everybody will say, clearly, old masters are last season. But in fact, what happened? The risk entirely flipped, and nobody is now talking about the Warhol picture. It limped away. It just made its reserve of 60 million. And what I thought was a very amusing and possibly prophetic moment was that the lot immediately following the successful sale of the Salvator Mundi was a picture by Basquiat. Anybody know what happened to that? It bought in. Not a single bid. And it's possible to see, for the optimists amongst us, I think, in that sort of amazing 30 minutes of auctioneering theatre, quite a harbinger of a dramatic shift in what may happen in the destiny of old master pictures compared to the more contemporary market, which, as we all suspect and know, I think, is built on much shakier foundations. I think the old master market at auction is a more accurate reflection of pure desire and taste. So, in all, I think it's a perfectly bad time for someone like me to stop being an old master dealer. But anyway, we've shown these pictures before, but does anybody know, now we've had established that the Salvator Mundi is the most expensive painting ever sold, an old master, and last year was the most expensive painting at auction. Does anybody know what the most expensive picture sold the year before that was? It was also an old master. It was the pair of Rembrandts, 160 million euros. So that narrative that we see in the old masters in the New York Times type article, that nobody's buying these pictures anymore and that they don't fetch high prices, has suddenly changed. And I think it's no accident that there hasn't been any of those kind of articles in the New York Times. They've gone rather quiet lately, that pitch. But that notwithstanding, it's undeniably the case that the old master market, which encompasses, let's face it, 500 years of art, is a huge category. There are all sorts of changes and fluctuations in taste within that. And I think there's no doubt at all that certain sectors are less popular now than they used to be. I think a certain type of Dutch still life is not the most exciting picture to sell if you're a dealer anymore. Sorry to specialists in those here. But that said, within the still life category, there are pictures which are suddenly much more popular. So still lifes by Court, for example, they have a great sort of very modern feel about them, don't they? You can imagine that fitting quite well in a contemporary Manhattan apartment. Well, there's no surprise that that is now a very valuable type of still life. So the market is really not the be-all and end-all, but I'm just using it as a sort of immediately tangible barometer of taste and demand out there. As I said, I'm in the optimistic category, and I look at the queues that we sometimes see for big-name old master exhibitions. This was the queue outside the Leonardo show in London. And then we've already mentioned the fantastically successful Hieronymus Bosch show at both the Prado and in Holland. Over 1 million people went to see those two shows. And for the figures for 2016, I don't have the figures for 2017, but for the museum attendance figures for 2016, it's undeniably the case that many more people went to see old master exhibitions than went to see contemporary art exhibitions. So I think these are little facts that we must retain to give us confidence in our minds. Why was Bosch so successful? Well, he is a big name, but he's not the biggest name. But I think it's interesting that I think his art is the kind of art that fits very well in today's environment for museum visitors. There's something of the, do you have Where's Wally in Holland, in Europe? There's something of the Where's Wally aspect about Bosch's pictures, isn't there? They invite discovery. They invite close looking. And I think in today's digital age, where we're all going around taking snaps of interesting and curious things to share with people, in a single picture by Bosch, you've got about 100 tweets, haven't you? If you really wanted to share things with people. I mean, there are so many fantastic details. And I will talk about that later, that sense of visual discovery, if we want to get people interested in old master pictures. But not everything is rosy in our world, ladies and gentlemen. I think we have significant challenges. Jane talked earlier about the need to secure more diverse audiences. This is definitely true. We all need to really think. I don't know the answer of how we're going to do that, but I think it's a major challenge that we all need to think about. We certainly, as Jane said, need to work on younger audiences and how to get younger audiences to engage with old masters. And we also need to think about how to engage with global audiences. All our museum websites these days are very good. Major museum websites are very good, but none of them are in Chinese. And 3 of the bidders for the Salvator Mundi were in fact from Asia, which was, I think, an extraordinary statistic if you think about the future health of the old master market. I was talking the other day to an auction house specialist who had taken the picture to Hong Kong. And this was someone who had also taken pictures to Moscow and all sorts of new markets to try and persuade new buyers and all these Russian oligarchs to take an interest in old masters. And he was telling me that in his experience, the way Chinese visitors engaged with old masters was quite extraordinary. The depth of interest that they have, much more than in other international countries when showing them Western European old master art. So I think this is something we all need to think hard about. We've mentioned earlier also the fact that not many students taking up art history courses are choosing to study old masters. And this is something we all need to think about addressing. Recently, I went to give some careers advice to a bunch of people who were just about to graduate from doing an art history course at a major British university. And I put up this image on the screen, and I asked them who had painted it. And there were about 40 people there, and only one of them got the answer, which is, of course, Titian. I can hear it somewhere. I can hear it, yeah, well done. But I said to them, well, what have you been doing for the last few years? And the rather sad answer came back was reading, not looking, reading. And we, in this room, I think we're all on the good side in this battle, because as curators, we're very focused on objects and getting people to look. But I think we need to work harder to reach out to our colleagues in the academic sector to form relationships and try and get students out of the classroom, into the museum stores. Sometimes I'm amazed in Britain, in my experience, you have major university towns with major university museums, and the two hardly talk to each other. I really am at a loss to explain that, but somehow we need to shake heads together. Stepping back a generation, this is my daughter downstairs. We were here the other day. Wonderful exhibition, wonderful collection. Really enjoyed coming round. We love Bruges. But she sat down in front of the picture and she wanted to know what was happening to the man lying down. Now, how do you explain someone being flayed alive to a 3-year-old? I must say I struggled. But the point I want to make is, had I not known about the subject matter, had I been a parent taking their kid to a museum for the first time, and maybe going for the first time myself, I looked at the label to try and find what the story was, and there's nothing on it. There's a title. And then my daughter excitedly went to come closer to the picture and was immediately told, oh, you must stand back. The picture is glazed. I understand that preservation is the most important thing. But I think all museums, and in Britain we have a thing called Kids in Museums. Do we have that? Is there anything like that in Europe? It has a manifesto. Kids in Museums has a manifesto of 10 points for museums to welcome children. And not saying no is number one, because it's so easy to make people feel slightly intimidated in our world. In the retail trade, there's a phrase, threshold resistance, and that implies that sort of feeling of fear that we sometimes feel to go into a shop. I mean, jewelers are sort of the obvious example where you feel you have to press the bell. And as soon as those slight barriers are in our way, we feel scared, don't we? I mean, even as an old master dealer, sometimes I feel quite scared going into my colleagues' or my former colleagues' galleries. Press the buzzer, wait for someone to look at you, start to feel slightly afraid. And I think in museums, especially for young people, we need to focus on these kind of problems. But anyway, I'm not here to try and tell museum directors how to do their job. I'm here to talk about the wider way in which we might try and engage new audiences with old masters. As was mentioned earlier, in Britain I present a BBC show called Britain's Lost Masterpieces. And I've had a little bit of success in being able to pitch these ideas to broadcasting commissioners in how to get them to commission a program. So we've worked on artists like Jordans and Joseph Wright of Derby, and names that are not the biggest names. We've had some big names, but not the biggest names. And if I went to a television commissioner and said, I really want to make a film about Jordans, they would go, I don't think anyone's interested in that. But if you say, I want to make a film about a Jordans that we've discovered, which is a discovery, and we'll show the process about how you discover it and how Jordans painted it and how we can prove that Jordans painted it, well, then suddenly it's a very different beast. And this ties back in earlier on with what I was saying about Bosch, that sense of visual discovery, which I think is absolutely crucial to getting people to engage with old masters, and particularly their craft and the way they were painted. In Britain, I don't know if it's the same in Europe, but in Britain we're slightly afraid of the concept of connoisseurship and even the concept of authorship. There is this idea of, well, it doesn't really matter who painted it, but I can tell you from experience, it really matters to museum visitors who painted these things. And if I could sum up the best way, the one thing that I think is absolutely crucial in the way we need to represent old masters for new audiences, it is this. I'll paraphrase Bill Clinton, it's the stories, stupid. There is a reason, I think, that this amazing book by Gombrich has been so popular. It's the story of art. We are human people, and we respond to human stories. And that certainly is what gets people interested in watching the sort of television programs that I make. And I think, if we're honest, we need to bring about a revolution in the kind of stories that we tell museum visitors. So I want to talk very briefly about, first of all, the stories we tell, how we tell them, and what we use to tell them. An exhibition that's doing fantastically well at the moment in London is about Charles I's collection, full of amazing pictures. I'm sure many of you have been. But it's a very appealing narrative. It's an easy-to-understand narrative to someone who may not be used to going to an exhibition on Titian or Rubens, all of which is included in this show. The concept of a king who loved art so much that he bought so much of it ended up bankrupt and lost his head. It's a wonderful way to get people to engage with his collection and old masters. And I think that's what we sometimes have lost sight of in art history, that sense of a strong narrative, biographical-based storyline. There is a tendency sometimes in art history to assume that what we're doing is trying to solve deeply theoretical puzzles that artists laid down for us 500 years ago and which no one has ever solved until now. But I think we are in danger of losing touch with the very sometimes simple, basic narrative stories that artists were trying to tell us. And we've also, I think, slightly lost touch with the idea that so many of these artists were just small businessmen trying to make a living. And they weren't always trying to set future generations of academics deeply philosophical puzzles and riddles to solve. I was recently at a conference on Lely, and someone put up this lovely picture by Vermeer in which the painting in the background is thought to be a lost early Lely. And there was great discussion on what did this mean? What does this mean? And I felt immediately stupid because I stood up and said, well, it means that he owned a picture by Lely. The sort of the gasp of breath in the room that someone could say something quite so dumb. Now, I'm very used to saying dumb things, and I think it's very healthy, but anyway. So I mentioned earlier Britain's Lost Masterpieces. We have been lucky enough to work on pictures by Antonis Moore, Peter Lely, Joseph Wright of Derby, Peter Royal the Younger, Claude Lorraine, Jordans, Peter Paul Rubens, for most people. And unless you read the letters in the Burlington. Anyway, Does anybody want to hazard a guess as to which was our most popular and most viewed program? Which artist of that lot? Rubens? Jordaens? The Rubens was the least watched one. The most popular one was the Antonis Moore. A small name artist, a fantastically underrated artist. I'm passionate about his work. Brilliant picture, brilliant artist, of which most of our viewers, I'm convinced, would never have heard. But we presented his story, which is interesting in itself. I mean, fascinating, the challenges and the social history that he's up against at the time. We presented that in quite a straightforward way. But we also talked a lot about how Moore made his pictures, and we did that in a very visual sense. Moore, in most of his portraits, he starts off with the eye bang in the middle of the canvas. You could measure it. It's exactly in the middle. And that's the kind of little visual hook that gets people to really enter the world of craft of old masters, because then you can take them to show them other pictures by Moore and show them exactly the same thing, and they go, oh yes, I get it, and they feel involved and they feel welcomed, and it works. And sometimes, I think in exhibitions, here I'm being provocative again, but we tend to just show pictures and text, pictures and text, pictures and text. And I think we can all do better to show pictures in the context of imagery and pointing out things like the central eye and what have you. So that's one way we should tell pictures, and that brings me on to language. So my second point about how we tell these pictures. And I just wanted to quote a little excerpt from a recent Burlington magazine editorial. In a good deal of recent art history, felicitous style is rarely a consideration. But the imagined reader is there, drawn from a restricted circle of fellow academics who will, incidentally not knowingly, at the fashionable names quoted and cited that give the writer a spurious authority. Articles are couched in a careerist language to be peer-reviewed, peer-read for renewal of tenure. An initial distrust of plain English turns into a positive fear of it in case of reprisals. Now, I'm sure some of us in here have felt the need to overcomplicate the language that we use to write articles. We must stop it. We must. I beg you to stop it. Not all of you are doing it, and I appreciate that I'm just being provocative, but we must encourage those of us who are tempted to complicate their articles and things to stop it. The bad news is, ladies and gentlemen, this has been going on for hundreds of years. This is a great quote from Horace Walpole, writing in the 1740s. No science has so much jargon introduced to it as painting. The bombast expression of the Italians, the prejudice of the French, joined to the vanity of professors and the interested mysteriousness of picture merchants, that was people like me, have altogether compiled a new language. It is almost easier to distinguish the hands of the masters than the cant of the virtuosi. So, I think we should all print that over our desks. I also very briefly want to talk about the stories we don't tell. This is one of these suspected. This video is being, talk is being filmed, so I must be careful. This is one of these suspected, alleged, some say, fake pictures. A very, very good fake, if it is, brilliant fake, mimicking Franz Hauss, a picture that was announced by the Louvre. They even tried to buy it. But now that the case has become public, the Louvre has gone extremely quiet. Now, that's understandable, but I think we ought to be more honest and open about the stories we tell. It's a great story. And I think the sense that we shy away from these things actually helps convey to the public that impression that this is a world of some sort of mystique in which the curtains can very easily be drawn over things, especially if we don't like the stories. I'm making an episode of Britain's Lost Masterpieces, which will go out in the summer, in which I know I will be proved to be wrong about one of my attributional hunches. And it's one thing being wrong as a museum curator, but you try being wrong in front of millions of people on a worldwide television audience. It's quite humbling. But it's actually very refreshing. I think we can all learn from being wrong, and it's still a great way of getting people interested in the process of old masters and attributions. So, that's the stories we don't tell. I just very briefly, in my last point, I want to talk about how and what we use to tell these stories. And the best allies we have, ladies and gentlemen, are the objects that we all love. I don't know what the situation is in Europe, though, but in Britain, 90% of our national collection of oil pictures is in store. And as one of my crusades is to try and get pictures out of storage. Because each one of our objects in our museums is a little ambassador for us, which people can connect to. And we have to, I think, release the objects. And here I'm going to be provocative again. I know that this is a conference of curators and not conservators, but I think if we're all honest, we've allowed the balance of power in museums to shift a little bit too much towards the conservator side. This idea that, oh, you can't let things out because there may be a little bit of light will shine on one bit of it, and goodness knows what's going to happen to it, and so on. Recently, when I was trying to do a reconnaissance trip for an episode of Britain's Lost Masterpieces, I was told that I could not look at a painting in storage until a conservator had assessed its condition, which I found totally baffling. But the curators in the institution seem to be sort of entirely in fear of the conservators. I half suspect that actually that meant we don't know where the picture is, and so we're not going to let you in. But nonetheless, it was, I thought, illustrative of the power that conservators have. And I think, as curators, I would encourage you to be emboldened in standing up to them and allowing art to be shared more. The Rijksmuseum does fantastically well with its airport museums, and that's a great way of getting new audiences to look at old masters. I'm a great fan of Glasgow Museums in Britain, which has pioneered little micro-collection sites around the city, totally not in museums. This one is in the sports centre. And what they do is they take a rotating display of works from their collection and they stick them in places like sports centres and schools. And it's absolutely marvellous because it gets objects out, it gets people who wouldn't normally consider going to a museum to come past and look at something as they go and play a game of tennis or what have you. And it's no accident, ladies and gentlemen, in this world of funding cuts. The Glasgow Museums is quite well funded by a city council because it demonstrates all the time that it's good at making art relevant to the people of Glasgow. I just wanted to quickly flash up a little slide from a survey of youth audiences in Britain in the arts. This was done by Tate. And audience motivation for attendance. This pie chart on the left is quite useful. The first thing was the mixture of art, music, and activities. And that, I think, is exactly what James was talking about earlier in terms of we have to present things as part of an experience these days if we want young people to come. The next thing, 19% they went because specifically of what was on show. Now, that's quite a humbling response, I think. So it's not necessarily about Michelangelo. That's not going to just do it on its own. And then the next thing, very revealing, I go because my friends go. And I think that is vitally important for the next column. How do you hear about this event? Word of mouth, friend or family. Next one, social media. Now, so that's well over 50% of people hearing about things in a non-traditional way. So all those adverts on the sides of buses and what have you aren't necessarily working for new audiences. How many of the people in here are on Twitter? Raise a hand. Not many. I'm always surprised that I'm one of very few, I do a blog, which is mostly just ranting and therapy, but it's quite good in terms of it's sometimes engaging new people in Old Masters. Anybody have a blog here? I know Gary does. Gary Schwartz has a marvelous blog. Anybody else have a blog? I think we've all got to do better at this, ladies and gentlemen. We've all got to do better at our social engagement. And that we are living in a selfie age. Here's Beyonce. Museum exhibitions are, we have to accept these days that they are about giving people selfie opportunities. I know that's slightly uncomfortable for many of us, but that's what they are. And each person who does a selfie will get a wider circle of people to come and take part. The Rijksmuseum, marvelous again. There is a theme emerging here, I'm afraid, which is that the Dutch are marvelous at these things. And also honorable mention to Belgian museums, which are very good at putting images online. But that brings me on to my final point. How often do we see this? We were talking earlier on about these talks being filmed. And of course, one of the problems immediately is copyright restrictions. Even though we're dealing with photographs of images which are themselves out of copyright. But we've allowed this system to be built up where museums try and raise capital, try and raise revenue from images of pictures. Now, in a digital age, I'm afraid that makes no sense at all. And it's something that I've been campaigning about in the UK. Its most deleterious effect is in education. It's entirely understandable, isn't it? Why? Why should a small thumbnail portrait of George Washington have to be captioned with some ridiculous copyright statement? There is no copyright. Under European law, taking a slavish reproduction of a photo, of a painting, which is itself out of copyright, engenders no new copyright. And yet we all think that we have to clear these images, we have to pay someone money. But I've been doing some freedom of information requests in the UK, and for most British museums, they don't actually make any money out of selling images because it's such an expensive business to do it. But they just do it anyway because they think they have to. In the UK, we very nearly lost our A-level art history. And in part, it was because of image fees, because an A-level art history textbook is extremely expensive to produce compared to other subjects. So I would implore you all, again, another fantastic example of what we can do when we release the images. I would implore you all to go back to your museums, please, and talk to your colleagues in the finance side, talk to your colleagues in the conservation side, to release the images, to release the artwork, and to think about the stories you tell, and to think about the way you tell them. Thank you very much indeed.